and welcome to the Kink Perspective. My name's Chris. I'm a psychotherapist and consultant. Today, we are going to talk about things in our communities, inside of our kink sphere, relationships, and even how people choose who they listen to, how this is all quickly building trust, and when that gets assigned before anything has actually been experienced. It is something that I see time and time again. I've talked a little bit about this in the past, but today I'm going to kind of approach this a little bit differently. Because most of the time here, this doesn't even register to a lot of people while it's happening. Now, before I get into all of this further today, as I always do, I want to say thank you to all of you who keep listening, sharing the show, reaching out with these conversations, dropping me emails and notes about what's going on. I do read all of your messages, and I want you to know that somebody actually from Eastern Europe, in a country I didn't even suspect, listened. Um, I'll just say in the Russian Federation, sent me a message and said that they dare me to believe that I don't read their comments or emails. I do. I see them, right? I'm not going to name your city, but thank you. I'm glad the show found you. Um, I'm glad you can download the transcript and translate it into your language, right? If there is any questions for you, please let me know. I'll see if I can explain something further. No matter how you found your way here, I'm glad you're here, right? If you're listening through Spotify and you've got it on the app, do me a favor, rate the show 5 stars. That way it allows other people to find it. If you're following me on YouTube, like and subscribe. That way you'll know when new shows drop. If you're on Apple, do the same. Drop me some stars there. This allows people to keep finding the show that need to hear these conversations, that want to hear these conversations, right? There is no other show like this, right, that hits at these topics. Also, if you want to support the show directly and the work I do here, there is a link in the show's description. Any amount really does keep these conversations going, right? And I got something to tell you all at the end of the show about next week's show that I've been kind of building on for a while. All right, let's get back to today's topic. Now, most people think of trust as something that just builds over time, right? We start slow, build big. You get to know somebody, you watch their movements, how they respond, their actions align with their words, their consistency, and that's how trust forms. Now, that's the idea. That's, in essence, how it's supposed to work, but that's not always what's happening in these types of spaces or even between people. A lot of trust gets built indirectly. People aren't just trusting what they experience, they're trusting what they hear, and what they see gets repeated, and who gets positioned as credible, who others defer to without maybe even questioning anything. And over time, this creates this kind of shortcut. Someone becomes safe or experienced or a community leader, not because each person is verified for that for themselves, but because enough people treat them that way at first. And once that starts, this carries a lot of weight, and people will then engage differently. They're going to lower their guard, and it'll go down faster, at an exponential rate. They assume certain levels of safety without any test going forward, right? They believe in something, without testing it themselves, that this is solid, grounded. But underneath all of that, it doesn't come from any direct experience. This isn't about calling anyone out, okay? It's about slowing down and looking at how this actually forms, because once you start to see it, you also start to see how quickly it can shift. Now, again, there is a tie-in to a show I did a couple of weeks ago where I talked about men in positions of power. This is not just about men. This is about anybody in the community. But there is a tie back to that, right? Now, the same way trust gets built, it can change, sometimes quietly, and sometimes even all at once. When it's not anchored in something real, the shift doesn't take a whole lot. What I want to do today is break all of this down. What this kind of trust actually is and why people rely on it, and what happens when it holds, when it and then sometimes when it doesn't. So, what do I mean when I say what borrowed trust actually is? Let's get clear on what this actually is, because if you don't define it, especially, properly, it turns into a vague idea about influence or popularity, and that completely misses it. Borrowed trust is when credibility is assigned before you personally verify it. You haven't built it through some interaction. You've just acquired it through exposure. You view someone as safe or experienced, knowledgeable, or even authoritative, not because that you've tested it yourself, but because enough signals around someone say that that's who they are. And most of the time, this doesn't feel like a shortcut, it just feels like common sense. And you walk into a space, physical or online, and there are certain names that come up more than others. You might even hear them talked about or referenced. You see them tagged on, message boards or in group chats, and then you notice how people respond to them. There's a tonal shift, more respect, less questioning. And it's a kind of built-in credibility that doesn't need to be explained. And I'm going to actually throw in my own anecdote here, because a few weeks ago, or the past couple of weeks, I wrote something and somebody didn't like it, saying it was just generic advice that I'm not explaining, and it was kind of an attack. Now, I didn't engage with the person, not because they didn't want to, not because they pushed back, but the way they addressed me was, I don't do that. I've explained all this, but the pushback was fine, right? I acknowledged it initially until it became an attack. And I don't want people to agree with a lot of the premises that I write. And I'm glad if you do, if they resonate. But I do get a lot of you who'll go, this doesn't work in every instance. You're right. I don't speak to every instance. I speak to a generalized instance. So when you push back, it allows for us to have that dialogue. It allows you to build an understanding, a credibility, right? So I encourage that. But there are many who don't, because we just accept what we see, accept what we hear, accept how others' interactions are. So this is where it all starts. Let me bring this all back here, right? Reputation is usually the first layer, right? Someone's name pops up. There's a lot of different people that talk about it with different conversations, but the same person is mentioned time and time again. Not like it's a coordinated thing, but often enough so it just kind of sticks. So that familiarity builds, even if you've never had one interaction with them. Then we have visibility. They're active, they're present, they post, they engage, they're at events, they're doing demos, you see them enough that you start to feel established. It's not necessarily because of what they're saying or doing in any sort of deep way, but because they're consistently there. And then association comes next. Who they connect to matters. If they're linked to people who are already seen as credible, that perception transfers. It's indirect, but it's definitely strong. People assume a level of alignment without needing to check it. And then there's language, how others talk to them. Things like, oh, they're solid, they know what they're doing, you're safe with them. Those statements carry a lot of weight, especially when they're repeated by different people. Now, over time, they stop sounding like opinions and start sounding like facts. If you put that all together, something starts to shift. Now, a great example is some things that I talked about at the beginning of this year, in my first episode of this year, where there was a situation down in the southeast part of the United States. And most recently, where I've just heard about something inside of the central United States, right? Dominants or dungeon masters or mistresses or dominatrixes, it doesn't really matter, or even submissives. We hear these people, and then what we're not doing is building trust in ourselves with this. We are just taking what's given to us, right? So you don't feel like you're making this huge leap when you're trusting them. It already feels like it's established, right? It's grounded. You've done your due diligence, even if you haven't had any real interaction. Your entire environment has done all the work for you. That's borrowed trust. And it's not always wrong. That's the part that makes it harder to see. Sometimes the person doesn't line up with the reputation. You know, They're sometimes they are experienced and maybe they're safe and they're consistent. The system works just enough that people stop questioning it. But the structure itself is still unstable because none of it is anchored in your own experience. It's just built on what you've absorbed, observed, or seen, but nothing that you've verified. And that means your level of trust can move faster than the actual relationship supports. You see people and how they engage, right? So there's less hesitation, fewer questions. Boundaries are flexible, even if no one says that directly. Then there's an assumption that things are understood. Safety is already established, that this person has been vetted in the community, you know, doesn't matter doing what, needles, rope, whatever, somewhere along that line. But that vetting didn't come from you, it came from the environment. And the environment doesn't always get it right, not because people are intentionally misleading, but because everyone is working off the same signal. And if those signals are incomplete, exaggerated, or they're just not checked, they carry the same weight. That's where the risk sits. Not trusting, someone, right? It's not about not trusting in them, but it's trusting faster than that foundation allows. The connection hasn't caught up to the perception yet, but behavior starts moving as it has. And most people don't notice that shift when it happens. It feels natural, efficient, like you're navigating a space that you're supposed to. And you are paying attention, you read the cues, you trust what seems established. But what you're actually doing is stepping into a version of trust that was built before you got there. And once you're inside of that, it's easy to keep going forward without ever stopping to ask, where did that come from? Now, let's talk a little bit about the psychology behind all of this. Now, once you see the pattern, the next step is understanding why it holds so easily. It isn't about people being careless. It's not about how people process information under limits. No one has time or access or even the energy to evaluate every person they encounter through direct experience. Even I can't do that, right? Especially when we look at the environments where the majority of our interactions are brief, right? Or they carry some level of risk. Instead, people rely on the shortcuts that feel reliable enough, right? Social proof is one of the strongest indicators. When multiple people signal that someone is trustworthy, experienced, or safe, that signal compounds. It starts to feel less like an opinion and more like a consensus, and consensus carries its own authority. If enough people appear settled or something, you know, most individuals don't feel the need to reevaluate it from the ground up. Authority bias here adds to that. Titles, roles, visibility, experience, all of this creates an influence on how someone is received before they even speak. And in the kink sphere, this can show up through roles, years in the lifestyle, or how someone is positioned within a group. Those markers don't just describe someone, they shape how others engage with them. So questions get reduced. There's really no level of scrutiny, and then there's the assumption that the person has already been vetted. And then comes along group alignment. People are not just assessing individuals, they're orienting themselves around the social structure, trusting the same people that others have built trust in, creates social cohesion. It reduces that friction. And it signals that you understand the environment and how it works. There's a quiet pressure to stay within that alignment because stepping outside of it can feel like creating an unnecessary tension or placing yourself at odds with the group. And all of that operates very quickly, often without any sort of conscious tracking. But underneath all of that, those little cognitive shortcuts that we're doing, there's an emotional driver that makes them stick. Unfamiliar spaces carry a level of uncertainty. That uncertainty doesn't always present as fear, but it creates a low level of tension. So people look for a way to reduce that. Trusting someone who's already seen as established offers a kind of immediate relief. It removes the need to assess everything for yourself, and it gives you a point of orientation, right, to center on, someone to follow, listen, or even to defer to. And in our dynamics, that pull can be even stronger. Roles come with an implied structure. Dominance, submission, mentorship, guidance, these are not neutral positions. They do suggest or hint at a level of knowledge or control or experience. For someone entering or navigating those spaces, attaching to a person who appears established can feel stabilizing. It provides a framework. It definitely reduces our ambiguity. There's also a discomfort with not knowing. Uncertainty leaves too many variables open. People tend to resolve that by attaching to something that looks very defined. So if a person is already positioned as credible, it closes that gap quickly. It allows our decisions to be made without having to sit in the uncertainty for too long, because that uncertainty, again, is uncomfortable. And at that point, trust is no longer about an assessment, it becomes a way of regulating our internal tension. So if others trust them, it feels safer to trust them too. Not because the person has been fully evaluated, but because the alternative requires more exposure, questioning, or willingness to sit with not having a clear answer. And this is where it starts to connect to identity. Trusting certain people is not about them, it's about where you place yourself in relation to them. Aligning with someone who who's seen as credible can reflect back on you. It signals that you belong, that you understand the structure, that you're moving in the right way within that space. That alignment can become part of how someone organizes themselves socially, who they listen to, reference, defend, or even defer to. And over time, that shapes not just the individual interactions, but how someone moves within the community as a whole. We see this with some of the bigger people on social media, and it doesn't really matter politics, religion, sex discussions, right? Anybody who has a large following, and I am not talking low numbers, I am talking very big numbers 20, 30, 50, 80,000 followers. It no longer becomes about, I'm going to question this. It's that I have to go along, otherwise, I get dogpiled on, right? And that's the problem, because all of this, once this system is in place, it tends to reinforce itself. If someone is already trusted, they're given more access, more interaction, visibility, and then the opportunity to be referenced again. That increases repetition. It strengthens somebody's perception, and it deepens that whole initial signal. And guess what? This becomes a loop. Trust leads to visibility, visibility reinforces trust. And because it often works, because many people do align with their reputation, the system doesn't get questioned. It feels efficient, functional, if you will. It allows people to move through complex environments without having to constantly reassess anything. But the underlying structure hasn't changed. The trust is still based on signals that originated outside of direct experience, which means it can hold, without being fully grounded. And it can also shift without a whole lot of warning. Understanding this doesn't require rejecting trust altogether. It means recognizing what it's built on, whether it comes from something you've actually seen or experienced, or something you've absorbed and accepted just because it felt established enough not to question it. The difference is subtle in the moment, but it shapes how people engage far more than they realize. We have to pay attention to that. Now, how does this all play out in our BDSM and our community spaces? As this moves out of theory into actual interactions, it becomes easier to see how it shapes behavior. In our spaces, roles carry meaning before anything personal is established, right? We hear the terms, we hear the monikers: dominant, submissive, mentor, experienced, rope rigger, right? They don't land as some sort of neutral descriptor. They come with an implied competence, control, or understanding. When someone is seen through that lens, people don't approach them the same way they would without someone in that position. There's a shift in how quickly trust forms. It doesn't start at zero and build through interaction. It starts part way in. There's an assumption that certain things are already in place, that they know what they're doing, that they've navigated situations like this before, that they understand the boundaries and the risks and all of these expectations. That assumption changes how people engage. Questions get asked differently, or guess what? Not at all. There's less friction at the beginning, less hesitation, right? And all of a sudden, it feels smoother and more certain. But that smoothness isn't coming from the relationship itself, it's coming from what has already been assigned to the person before the interaction began. That's where the first shift happens. Trust escalates faster than the connection can actually support. And instead of building this over time, it jumps ahead. People move into conversations and dynamics or situations with a level of openness that would normally take longer to reach. It doesn't even feel rushed at this point because the perception is that the groundwork has already been there and laid ahead of us. But it hasn't been laid between those two people, it's been inherited. From there, boundaries start to adjust, not obviously or deliberately, but in small decisions, giving a little bit more leeway, letting something pass that might have been questioned in another context, right? Or interpreting something completely differently just because of who it's coming from. The person hasn't necessarily done anything different, the response to them has. That's where people begin to override their own hesitation, not because the hesitation appears, but because it's getting reinterpreted. If something feels slightly off, the immediate move isn't always to pause and assess, it's to explain away, right? They say something like, they probably know what they're doing. There's likely context I'm missing. Other people trust them. That internal check gets reduced and softened. And once that happens a few times, it becomes easier to keep moving forward without stopping. The reliance shifts outwards. Instead of using your own experience as the primary reference, you start leaning more on the established perception around that person. And at the community level, this becomes even more pronounced. Once someone is seen as a leader or a central figure, the way people interact with them changes in a consistent way. They're given more space, they get more access, they get more benefit of the doubt when something is unclear or doesn't land cleanly. Their behavior gets interpreted through a forgiving lens, not because people are ignoring what's happened, but because the starting point is different. And if someone without that position acts in a certain way, right, it gets evaluated directly. If someone with that position does the same thing, it gets filtered first. There's an extra step where people try to make all of this fit the existing perception before questioning it. And that difference matters. It means the same behavior can be received in two completely different ways depending on who's doing it. Over time, that creates an uneven structure where some people are consistently evaluated and others are consistently interpreted. This isn't about accusing individuals of misuse or intent. Most of the time, the people in those positions are not actively trying to take advantage of it. They're operating within the same system. They've also been positioned through their same signals. The issue here, at its core, is the structure itself. When trust is assigned early and reinforced collectively, it changes how risk is perceived. It doesn't remove risk, but it makes it less visible. It delays when people question something. It extends how long someone is given the benefit of the doubt. Now, here I'm going to inject another anecdote. You can see this starting to play up when the community starts speaking up about, I'm just going to pick a state like Oregon, right? Recently, I've been seeing some things come out of Oregon and Washington. Now, I'm not targeting the Pacific Northwest for any particular reason, but most recently, I've seen some issues regarding some clubs there. A couple of clubs in New York, right? Some of them in the South. It's because the same structure is in place and we're doing the same thing over and over. We're trusting the perception, but we haven't established the credibility ourselves. And we don't want to go against the group because then we will be ostracized, right? So, in these spaces where these dynamics already involve vulnerability, power, erotic exposure, that delay matters because by the time something is clearly recognized, the interaction is often already moved further than it would have under a slower, more grounded pace. And that's how the pattern plays out. Not through some sort of obvious breakdown, but through small shifts in how people engage, how quickly they move, and how much they rely on what's already been decided about someone before they've even had a chance to decide it for themselves. Now, here comes the flip side with all of this. This is when trust collapses. So now that you see how this builds, the other side of this becomes easier to recognize. The same structure that assigns trust can also take it away, and it often moves just as quickly. When trust is built on perception, a shift in that perception is enough to change how someone is seen. It doesn't require direct experience, it doesn't require a long series of interactions. It comes from a story, a reframing, or a few voices interpreting something differently. And once that shift starts, it spreads in a similar way. Narratives change, right? Someone name may come up and there's a different context surrounding it. Then there's a tonal shift, and now people start to hesitate where they didn't before. And questions begin to surface, but not always directly. It's more subtle at first, you know, and now we have a pause in how people start to engage. Then the group begins to recalibrate, not through some sort of formal process, but a collective response. Fewer interactions, less visibility, less automatic trust. The same signals that once reinforced credibility start to weaken or reverse. And what's important here is that the person at the center of it doesn't necessarily change at the same pace, or in some cases, at all. What changes is how they're being interpreted. And that's the instability. If trust wasn't grounded in a direct experience to begin with, then it doesn't take the direct experience to undo it. It moves with the narrative around the person, not just the reality of their behavior. And this is where the community response starts to show its own patterns, right? People begin to distance themselves very quickly. And part of that is self protection. If something is uncertain, the best move is to step back. That can happen before anything is clearly understood, just based on the possibility something has shifted. And then there's also hesitation. Not everyone speaks up right away, even if they notice something. So someone holds a certain position in the community, right? And challenging that position carries its own weight. It risks here that social friction, maybe even being wrong, or stepping outside of what others are accepting. There's a waiting period where things are felt before they're said. And during that time, different responses start to emerge. Some people hold on to the original perception longer. They try to look for an explanation that keeps it all consistent. And then some other people, they move away faster and they adjust their behavior based on the new signals they're picking up. Sometimes the focus shifts to protecting the structure itself. Communities often rely on a sense of stability, a shared understanding of who's safe, who's experienced, and who is trusted. When that gets challenged, there could be pressure, directly or indirectly. And to maintain that helps maintain that stability, not necessarily by denying what's happened, but by slowing it down, how it's addressed, or even trying to keep it contained. Other times, the opposite happens. The shift moves too quickly. The person is redefined, overnight without grounding, to fully understand what actually occurred. So the whole story and narrative changes in a different direction, but is driven by the same mechanism, collective interpretation rather than direct verification. And in both cases, the underlying issue is the same. Trust wasn't anchored in the personal experience in the first place, it was built through shared signals, and it's being adjusted through those same signals. That doesn't mean that every shift is inaccurate. Sometimes concerns are valid. The change reflects something real that is needed to be addressed, but the speed and direction of that change are still shaped by the structure. What people are responding to is not just the person, but the version of them that exists within the group. And when that version changes, behavior changes with it. And that's where the full pattern becomes visible, right? Trust rises through repetition and visibility and alignment. It holds as long as those signals stay consistent. But when they change, the response follows. And that's often without the same level of engagement that would have normally defined trust in the space. Which brings it back to the core issue. When trust is built without direct experience, it doesn't just form differently, it also breaks differently. And in both directions, the person at the center is being moved by something larger than their own actions alone. Now, to wind this down today, pardon me, this isn't about pulling back from people or moving through communities with any type of level of suspicion. That's not what I'm talking about. Trust is still necessary. It's how we connect and collaborate and build anything that's going to have weight or longevity. But there is a difference between trust that develops through contact and trust that's been handed to you already formed. And most of the time, the difference isn't really obvious. It feels the same in the moment and it carries that same sense of certainty. But where it came from changes how stability actually is. If it's grounded in your own experience, it tends to hold because it's been tested, even if it's in a small way. If it's built from what you've absorbed around you, it can feel just as solid, but there's no anchor. That doesn't make it wrong, it just means it's untested. And when something is untested, it moves differently. It can grow quickly and it can shift just as quickly. Not because people are unpredictable, but because the foundation underneath hasn't been established in that direct way. And what this really comes down to is awareness. Not second guessing every interaction, not slowing everything down to the point where nothing moves, but having a clear sense of what you're actually relying on when you decide to trust someone. Now, whether it is something you've seen or experienced or, something that feels established because of how it's been presented to you, that distinction is easy to miss, but it shapes how people engage more than they realize. So here's my question for all of you today. Is the trust you're placing in someone coming from what you know or from what you've been shown by others? That's what I want you to sit on today. Now, a couple things for coming up, right? Number one, next week, exciting. I'm very happy. Um, Hi there, Catsuit is going to be on the show. I've been talking. I was on his show last year, right? There is a link in my bio on Fet that has that episode. I've been wanting to bring him on the King perspective for a very long time. Timing and a lot of my work didn't line up, but we finally agreed. So next week, that episode's coming out. Also, I want to let you know, starting in May, so it's not a surprise. I'm working out the final details now, but it looks like I might have a sponsor. So I want you to be prepared. You may see something or hear something, but that's it, right? It's just a sponsor. Okay, it doesn't change what I'm delivering. I'm not changing what I say or do to shape my show around that. I just want you all to be aware of that. I want to be transparent. Okay. 5 years into doing this, right? So I feel very blessed that somebody wants to do that. But as been very clear, and they're very much on board so far, doesn't change what I'm going to say, right? I stay consistent. On top of that, is there anything else? I keep getting asked about certain situations online on social media. Look, I don't get into a lot of I don't police the world, and I am not here to run the psychology for the world for every club or for every king space that's out there. I can't. I don't have the bandwidth, right? The people who get the majority of my bandwidth are the military, then those who I'm directly working with, right? That's who gets my bandwidth. When I write or interact or even do the show, that's all for you. It's for your benefit. Or if I work and do a worksheet. And by the way, I think I just released my 8th worksheet or ninth. I can't even remember. But you can get those. Those are free to download. All you have to do is go to my website and click on the resources, and it'll take you to my drive. You can download the resources. There is no paywall. They're completely free. They're to help you in your journey, right? But let me get to some of these community interactions. I know some of these stories are painful, and I'm very sorry. I can't jump into the middle of every one of them because I don't have enough context, and often I'm not in those scenes, right? Each community, each scene is different, right? I started off in Atlanta and had some interactions in New York and the UK and South Korea and some other places. I'm familiar with those scenes because I've been there, and even LA. But that doesn't mean what I've done in those places translates to what's going on in Kansas City or uh, Nebraska or even in Chicago, because everybody's going to have something different. A question I'm very happy to answer, and I'll be direct. The question, I think, is, are we muddling what's going on with bringing sex into kink? I'm going to give you my opinion on how my journey went, because this, I think, also ties to a lot of what I'm talking to. When I started my journey in BDSM, it was very clearly told to me BDSM and sex are not synonymous. If you negotiate them into your dynamic, that's fine, but it's not a guarantee. Yes, our interactions are erotic. There is no denying that, right? They're very intimate, but that doesn't mean just because there's intimacy on that level, it means we're going to be sexual. With that said, yes, I do realize a lot of these clubs now are turning into a crossover. All I can tell you from a personal stance for me, I won't attend those dungeons. And there have been quite a few, even in the last 6 months, I don't go to. I'm not giving any names because that's fine. That's how they want to do it. But that's not what I relate to in the BDSM sphere. If you do, that's fine. There's nothing wrong with that. That's on you. I just view it differently, right? So there'll probably be a show. I've talked about this a little in the past about levels of consent within different lifestyle groups. And BDSM, or the fetish community, is far different from the polyamorous community, which is then far different from the swinger community, which is even different from the nudist community. These are all different communities. But when you overlay a lot of different groups, they're all bringing their own levels with them, right? So you just have to take those things, slow them down, and see what works for you. So hopefully that answers your question. The person who asked me, I'm going to leave it at, I'll give you a region. I'll leave it for the person who asked me in Europe. Okay. At least I hope I translated your question correctly. Right. But I want you to know, yes, I am listening. I can't tell you why it's shifting. I think a little bit next week, um, he and I are going to talk about some of these things because we're older guys. We've been in the scene for a very long time. As a matter of fact, I'd really love to bring Red in. I had her on the show a few months ago. It was a great conversation. Red Leather Warrior, right? She's out of the central US. We all share similar values and understandings of what we like, right? And that's the key phrase here. I think you all should also listen to before I get back to my question today. What we like and what we gravitate towards in the current view of what BDSM is in this community, right? Does that make sense? Hopefully it does, right? Are traditional clubs still there? Yes, you're just going to have to work a little harder to find them, right? And I've said this before and I'm going to say it again. Outside of communication, the one thing this lifestyle requires, especially if you are by yourself right off the bat, is a whole ton of effort. If you're not going to put the effort in, then you're not going to get a whole lot of effort out. Right? So that's it. All right. Enough of all that for today. There's shameless stuff coming up. Right? No, I don't have any other updates for you all. Let me bring you back to the question. I want to round this out today and bring this back down to where we are talking about trust, right? Borrowed trust in the community. Here's the question again, one more time for you all. And I want to see some more interaction on social media, right? Whether it's, I don't care if you email me, Substack, Fetlife, Instagram, whatever, right? I have a lot of social media, but I'm going to be honest, quite a few of them, I have them to have them, but I don't really do a lot there. It seems for like X. I just post my stuff and kind of leave. I don't really sit there. Okay. But the question is trust you're placing in someone coming from what you know or what you've been shown, right? Maybe you need to sit with that and think about it for a little bit. Right? Let me know in the comments. Let's talk about this because it's obviously a hot button topic. It's present and it's there. Let's have a conversation. Let me know your thoughts and experiences. Until next time, everybody, be safe, stay king.